Hi guys, thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I'm going to be exploring how Steve Jobs actually sold his first 50 computers. And some of the things that you're going to learn from this story are things that can actually help you also in your journey as a businessman or as a salesperson who is actually trying to see how he can actually improve his sales skills. So if you're yet to subscribe to this channel and you're joining us for the first time, kindly hit the subscribe button. So today's story is something that a lot of us might not have heard in this dimension before. But a lot of us might know about Steve Jobs, or you know some of the things that he has done. You know, the Apple computer, the iPhone that we all use, the iPad. We know about his works. And so he's a great person that we can actually learn from. Because one of the things you must realize is that the stories of men that have gone ahead of us are things that would actually inspire us that are coming behind. And there are things that can also help us that are even in this present day doing one thing or the other and can help us to improve in the things that we all find ourselves doing. Steve Jobs was actually born originally by Abdul Fattah John Jandali and Joan Schiebel, who was from Wisconsin. So Abdul Fattah was actually from Syria. As a matter of fact, his father had oil refineries and was also into business. Likewise, Joan's father as well. So there were people that were doing well. But her father was a devout Catholic man and he didn't want her to have anything to do with anyone who was not a Catholic. So Abdul Fattah ended up taking her to Syria and she got pregnant for him in 1954. And in 1955, she was due to put to bed. But she couldn't, get married to Abdul Fattah then because of her father. So she had to move to San Francisco to live with a doctor who used to help unmarried mothers. So he helped her deliver and he also used to help them to organize adoption. So at that time, what had happened was that the man was trying to actually get Steve Jobs adopted by a lawyer. So the lawyer and his wife were actually looking for a girl child, not a boy. He couldn't get them to be adopted to adopt Steve Jobs because Joan, who was Steve Jobs' original mother, actually wanted Steve to be adopted by a parent or parents that were educated. So she wanted him to get education. So Paul Jobs and his wife, Clara Agopian, who had got married and they didn't have a child, they were approached to actually adopt Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs' mother told them that they must sign a bond that they were going to educate him because she didn't initially wanted to go ahead to sign the adoption papers. But at the end of the day, she ended up signing the papers. So they actually now gave him the name Stephen Paul Jobs and started living with them. So from the get-go, they already told Steve Jobs that he was actually adopted. So he knew that he was adopted. And that actually messed up with his mind a bit because he was wondering why would his parents actually leave him. So that actually made him to be a bit restless. It was even mentioned that in school, he used to actually do a lot of pranks. Him and a friend called Rick Ferrentino, they were pranksters in schools when they were in elementary school. One of the famous pranks that they played was when they said everyone should bring their pets to school. So the kids had actually brought their dogs and their cats to school. And at that time, dogs and cats were chasing one another. There was even a time where they even went to reset the locks, on the bikes of some of the kids. And at that day, they were just trying to figure everything out in school. So they were playing lots of pranks. So it was actually said that there was a particular teacher in Steve Jobs' school who was able to get him to learn. Her name was Mrs. Imogen Hill. And what she used to do was that she would bribe him and say, if you're able to solve this math equation, I'm going to give you this amount of money. And that got him into learning. And so Steve Jobs was able to actually put in an effort to learning because of what the woman actually did for him. And that's the power of, you being able to help the child sometimes, to be able to overcome some of the things that you see them doing. Because a lot of the children that you see, they have great potentials. And so you must be able to, discover that potential in them and find out the best way by which they can be taught. So there was a man who helped Steve Jobs to actually get into the HP Explorers Club. And it was in that place that Steve Jobs built what we call a frequency counter. So his father, Paul Jobs, had exposed him to electronics. And that's the power of exposure. A lot of things that a lot of us have actually picked up by virtue the things that we've been exposed to growing up. And that's why you must realize that for you to actually be able to learn a lot of things or to even teach your children a lot of things, you have to expose them to those things. When Steve Jobs got to 9th grade, he actually started attending the class of John Malcolm. So John Malcolm at that time was a retired Navy officer who had started teaching electronics. And so Steve Jobs used to attend his class just to learn electronics at that time. So John McCullum used to have a student by name Steven Wozniak. Steven Wozniak was his favorite student because he was very good in electronics. As a matter of fact, Steven Wozniak's father was an engineer who used to pride himself in engineering, and he felt that a lot of people who were doing business, were not as good as the engineers. So Wozniak used to read his father's books. That was how he learned a lot about electronics, and his father used to expose him to some of the things that he did. There was a time that it was mentioned that he built what we call a metronome that sounded like a bomb. And he had also gone ahead to do a lot of other things, growing up with electronics. But it was someone that, had actually secluded himself. When a lot of his friends were going to parties, he was just busy, trying to develop and learn a lot of things about electronics. That was how he was. Steven Wozniak ended up being one of the partners, to Steve Jobs. And that's how their partnership got them into forming Apple. And how did that come to play? So at the time, Steve Wozniak actually got a part-time job with Sylvana, and that was where he was first exposed to Fortran. And he started understanding how, microprocessors work. And after that time as well, he got a job with a company that was producing computers for California department. And that's where he met someone called Bill Fernandez. And Bill Fernandez was one that introduced him to Steve Jobs. So when he and Steve Jobs actually met, they actually talked about the pranks that both of them used to play. They got tightly connected to each other. As a matter of fact, Steve Jobs saw him as someone that even knew a lot more than him. And that was one of the things that actually glued him to Steve Wozniak. So their friendship actually grew from there because they actually got to know that they had a lot of things in common. In 1971, Steve Wozniak was actually reading an article by the Esquire on the secret of Little Blue Box. And that was, something that had to do with how hackers and phone phreakers used to make long distance calls over the node of AT&T network. So he popped an idea into him that he could actually make something like that. And he was able to come up with something that he called a blue box at that time, where you could use it to make long distance call. So when Steve Jobs got a hold of him and, he said that, that they could actually sell this thing. So they started making it. They got the part for about $40 and they were selling it for $150. There was a particular guy that wanted to buy from them. As a matter of fact, when this guy got to this card, I think the guy pulled out a gun and told them to hand it over to him. Steve Jobs said he wanted to initially slam the door, but he said it was risky because if the guy shot at him, that would have been the end of his life. But the guy gave them a number to call. The guy took it away and went to try it and told them to come back and collect it. But Steve was like, we're not going back to get this thing. But that didn't stop their journey. They went on ahead to do a lot of other things together. When I got a job with HP and was working there then, in 1974, I think Steve Jobs had dropped out of school and he moved back to his parents' place at Los Altos. And there he got a job with Atari, who was a video game manufacturer. And in Atari was where he met a man called Ronald Wayne, who at that time was a staff of Atari, but had tried to start his own company making slot machines, but the company had failed. And in Atari was where he also learned a lot about, business and how a product design worked. So he learned a lot at Atari that ended up going ahead to help him. And so you see that in this journey, there were lots of things that he had picked up at different places that he had gone to. There was this particular club called the People's Computer Club that had later transformed to become the Homebrew Club. It was founded by Gordon Fred and Fred Moore in 1975. So it was like a place where people used to come to and share ideas about computer education. Steve Wozniak was actually invited to attend the launch event in Fred Moore's garage. And that was where they were launching the Atari. The Atari was like one of the first personal computers at that time. As a matter of fact, Paul Allen and Bill Gates had built like a basic interpreter for the Atari at that time. And so they were launching it at the Homebrew Club and Steve Wozniak was there. It was at that place that Steve Wozniak got an inspiration about how a microprocessor works. And that actually made him to think about what he was also working on. He was working on something already, but he saw that this was something that he could actually put all the other components on the microprocessor, and then he could come up with a keyboard that could translate signals to a screen and people could see what they were typing. And that was how the idea of the Apple One came into being. And he quickly went back to try and make, something for himself. He bought the parts. He wanted to actually buy the microprocessor, but the microprocessor was expensive. That was the Intel 8080. That was the in microprocessor at that time, and he couldn't buy that one, and he had to go and buy a Motorola 4800 microprocessor that was a bit cheaper, and he was able to couple the parts together. So when he finished coupling the parts together and Steve Jobs saw it, Steve Jobs was like, oh wow, this is great. Can't we put a memory disk into this so just to make it improved? So Steve Jobs was that kind of person that was always thinking of how can we make this thing better? That was the way he was wired. He had this commercial side to him. And, they took it to the Homebrew Computer Club and they showcased this to them. It was mentioned then that Bill Gates and Paul Allen were not really happy that people were using their basic interpreter for free and they were not paying them. And so they wrote a letter to the Computer Club saying that, if anyone was willing to pay them for the basic interpreter, that they should write a letter back to them. So Steve Jobs told Steve Wozniak that, as a matter of fact, they shouldn't just be, showing this thing for free. They should start thinking of how they can sell it. Wozniak had a calculator, an HP 68 calculator that he sold for $500, but the person eventually paid about $250 for it. And Steve Jobs had a Volkswagen Boss that he sold for $1,005. And after 2 weeks, the person he sold it to came back and said the engine had knocked. So Steve Jobs had to go and repair it. So at the end of the day, they were able to gather about $1,003. Which they used to start, their own initial business at that time, which was the Apple. So they were actually thinking about, a name to give to the business. So what had happened was that they had a deadline of when they had to come up with a name. And Steve Jobs at that time used to, go on fruit diets. So he was on the Apple farm one of the times. They had talked of Metrics as a name. They had talked of Executech as a name, but it didn't fly. They had talked about the People Computer International as a name, but those names didn't actually fly. So when Steve Jobs came back from his, Apple farm, walk at that day, he just said, oh, why don't we name it Apple? And he told Steve that, if we don't end up getting another better name, maybe we'll just leave it as Apple. Mike Makula, who was the first chairman of Apple at that time, said that the name didn't make sense, but it was something that actually gave them brand awareness. And so that was what Apple did for them, because the combination of Apple and computer was something that a lot of people felt that it was weird, but it gave them brand awareness. And so when they were able to come up with the name and start up the company, they started, doing stuff and trying to forge the company ahead. So what happened was that Steve Wozniak was still working at HP. He didn't want to leave the business at that time because he felt that the circuit board he had made could be used for other applications rather than just only Apple. So what Steve Jobs did was to go and talk to Ronald Wayne, who he had met at Atari, to come talk to Steve so that he could leave HP at that time. Ronald Wayne came and started trying to convince Steve, letting him realize that this is a potential for them and something that they could actually make lots of money from. But Steve Wozniak thought that because he was still working with HP, he felt that it was ethically right for him to actually talk to the HP management about this circuit board and see if it was something that HP could actually use on their own product as well. So he pitched the product to them in 1976. And they said no, that they were not going to work with this, that this was more of something that hobbyists were going to be using. And so that was how he ended up going back, to Steve Jobs. And they started Apple. So in the house of Ronald Wayne, they had met to sit down to formalize, the agreement. So Ronald Wayne acted as a documentator. He had crafted the agreement letter, written it in cursive writing, written all the letter terminologies. And what had happened was that they had apportioned 45% stake to Steve Jobs, 45% stake to Steve Wozniak, and 10% stake to Ronald Wayne. So Steve Wozniak was in charge of engineering, electrical engineering. Steve Jobs was in charge of electrical engineering and marketing, while Ron Wayne was in charge of mechanical engineering and documentation. So you understand that when starting a partnership, it's important that every of the partner had a part to contribute. So it's not just right to start a business with someone and then someone is not bringing in anything and he wants to take out of it. So you must clearly spell out the agreement from the beginning. So what happened was that Ron Wayne at that time, because he had started a business that had failed and he saw the way that Steve Jobs was really enthusiastic, he had gone ahead to even borrow money so that they could actually manufacture their product and sell. But he was not very comfortable because he felt that the energy that these guys were bringing was a lot. And at that time, he had assets and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak didn't have any assets. So he felt that they didn't have anything to lose. Because as at that time, the way they had structured the business was that if the business got into debt, all the things that the partners had, their assets were things that they were going to have to lay down to be able to pay the debt. And he was not ready for that. So what had happened was that after about 11 days, he went back and met Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and he said he wanted to pull out. So that was how he pulled out. He ended up getting about 2003, out of the whole thing. And they mentioned that in 2010, if Ron Wayne had actually stayed with them, his 10% stake would have worth about $2.6 billion. But they asked him and said, well, he didn't really regret because he didn't feel he could match up with the energy of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. But they went ahead to continue doing that stuff. So Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak pitched their product to the Homebrewing Club. And they started talking about, the features of their own Apple computer against the Atari. Mentioning it that the Apple at that time had a keyboard the Atari didn't have. And it had, some unique things to itself, the microprocessor and all that. But the microprocessor in the Atari was actually better than the one that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had brought, that's the Apple I computer. So when they were making that presentation, Steve Jobs got up and was saying that, okay, how much are people willing to pay for the Apple computer at that time? But a lot of people actually walked away and it was left with one very important man, Paul Terrell. Paul Terrell was the owner of the Byte Shop. He had started the Byte Shop in 1975 and he had started increased to about 3 locations and was looking to actually go global. So Paul Terrell waited behind and listened to what they were actually saying and he gave them his personal card. So the next day, what happened was that Steve Jobs, being a very enthusiastic person, someone that was energetic, someone that had a business mind, he went to look for Paul Terrell at the Byte Shop and he pitched the product to him and was able to get a sale out of that conversation. The first deal that Paul Terrell gave them was to supply 50 computers. So that's the power of sales. As a business owner, you are the number one salesperson. Sales and marketing is something that you must not be shy about. It's something that you have to go ahead to continuously do. So Steve Jobs was someone that was enthusiastic about selling. He didn't mind going the extra length. But Paul Terrell told them that they had to actually replace the circuit board because it was a cheap one that was going for around $50. And he said that they should actually replace it and ensure that they couple the parts together so that it's a full product that they are delivering. And he didn't mind paying about $500 to cover that expense. So that was how they got their first 50 computer deal. So at that time, when they were going to execute the project, one of Steve Jobs' former friends, Alan Bond's father, actually borrowed him $5,000. And he actually needed about $15,000 to actually complete the production of that stuff. So what had happened was that he had gone to a couple of banks. He even went to Atari, but Atari said they had to pay up front. They were going to get the chips. So he ended up going to Kramer's Electronics. And what happened at Kramer's Electronics was that they called Paul Terrell up. Paul Terrell was at a conference at that time and he had a voice that, there were some young chaps here who had said that he had given them an order for 50 products. Was that true? And he said yes. And so they were able to actually give them, the spare parts, but at a 30 days credit. And that was how they were able to get that order in. So from this lesson, you will see that this was someone that was not just interested in the product, but was also interested in how the product was sold. He was willing to go the extra mile. And you saw the power of partnership. Steve Wozniak was a guru at the product design, while Steve Jobs had the marketing thing, the business inclination on the inside of him. And that shows you the power of partnership. That when you're going into any form of partnership, you must ensure that both parties have something that they are bringing to the table. Not just one part bringing something and the other part not bringing anything. Because at the end of the day, that is what will make the partnership to be able to work. And the other thing you must also realize is that the product that you're trying to sell is as important as the sales that you're trying to do as well. Because the product is actually not very good. So there are things that have to go into the manufacturing of what you're trying to sell. And you must understand the product in and out to ensure that it has its own unique features that can give you an edge. So I believe that this story has actually inspired you and you would have picked one or two things from it. If you're yet to actually subscribe to this channel and the things that I've mentioned in today's video has actually been inspiring to you, kindly go ahead to hit that subscribe button. See you next time.